There we go. Looks like we're live. You're muted.
All right, sweet.
Cool.
Hello, everybody. Happy Easter. Uh, James, happy Easter to you. It's still the season.
It is. It is. And
Well, should we start with prayer like usual?
yes, please lead us.
All right. Okay. Let us pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Christ is risen from the dead, and by death he trampled death, and to those in the tombs he granted life. Almighty God, we ask you to bless our live stream tonight. And please bless those who are viewers, and bless those who bless our mission, bless the mission of the apostolate for marital intimacy, bless our staff, inspire us with your Holy Spirit to be exactly what you want this apostolate to be for your church and for the married couples therein. And we thank you for calling us to this work. And so we pray, Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, everywhere present, filling all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O gracious one. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Awesome. Well, as our usual, I will. Well, if my YouTube would work, I usually try to post a couple links that could be useful to people, but seems that my YouTube has decided it doesn't want to work with us. But
Okay, got it.
If that ends up deciding to be agreeable, then I'll post.
I can take care of that.
Yeah. So we want to include our, let's see, support our mission fund, and then the Patreon. Yeah, it's being weird. It doesn't want to let me post or comment. Yeah.
Well, so we have been having one of our best months yet.
Yeah, and it's definitely been a productive month with getting our um, our fundraising goals. We're so close to meeting it. Um, you know, which reminds me, anyone who donates to uh, our donor box account, right? So our support our mission campaign, or shares this live stream on your social media, and tags us in it, then there'll be, after this is over, we'll put everybody's name in a hat and do a drawing for um, a copy of Love and Responsibility by, of course, St. John Paul II, back when he was prelate. So, yeah, feel free to either share this and tag us in it so we know that you did so, and then, or you can donate, and we appreciate both. And you know what? If you do both, you get 2 entries. Why not?
There you go. That's man, great book. Still got to read it, but I really want to. It's on my list. How much of that went on to be the foundation for theology of the body? We don't consider ourselves a TOB or like one of the theology of the body organizations per se, but obviously, its significance is, it's very important. So,
I think that the philosophical understanding that was behind Love and Responsibility was very much already there. Um, um, I I'm not, so like I've read, like I'm familiar with both works. Um, Unfortunately, my familiarity is more academic in that I've read them entirely, but not quite in order. um, and so, uh, as far as like thinking about how his thought developed over time between the two, I couldn't really say. Um, but I do think that a lot of let me word it this way. I think that the what he expressed in those Wednesday audiences in theology of the body was he was already ruminating um, well before he even wrote Love and Responsibility. These are things that were very much on his heart and on his mind um, many years in advance. And the papacy just gave him the opportunity to speak about it even more.
Awesome. Fantastic. Um, yeah. So this, I think one of the things that helped us be the most successful this month is people were interested to see the examination of conscience that we've been working on.
Yeah, that's been a that was a another fun little happy accident um, of Meg and I were just having a chat in the car, and we try to go to confession on Saturday afternoons. There's a parish that has it in the afternoon here, and we were um, getting ready to do so. We're coming back from one of the local air bases. We had to go there for some drop off some uniforms or something. So we're trying to get back and get there pretty quickly. And Megan was like, "Well, can you pull up an examination of conscience and we'll do our examination together?" She was driving, and I was like, "I don't have one just sitting in the car." And she was like, "Well, make one." And I was like, okay. And I was like, "Give me like 5 minutes." And I started, just jotting down some ideas. And, you know, later that evening, I was like, that could actually be something kind of cool. Um, to especially to focus on the vocation of marriage. And yeah, so that was kind of a fun little, you know, happy little moment that seems to have been very much appreciated by many people.
What do you think are some things that might have come up in this? You know, when it became a more intentional, like, oh, this could be, a fruit of the apostolate. Things that you would, now advise married couples to be attentive to, when they're examining their conscience and when they're going to confession about, just how they've been as husband or wife.
Right. So a traditional examination of conscience is going to follow typically the Ten Commandments, right? Some versions will
Hmm.
follow the Our Father or the Beatitudes, right? Um, but this one, I thought, there are a great many versions of those that are fantastic. I'm particularly partial to the Fathers of Mercy examination of conscience. Um, But I was thinking, as much as I love talking about the fourfold intimacy, I was like, why don't we write one based on the fourfold intimacy? And then one specifically for husbands, one specifically for wives. And so as I started reflecting and ruminating on how that's different, right? Because obviously we still talk about all of the sins against all the commandments, but how that changes perspective and the focus, right? Where we're looking at um, your vocation sort of at the forefront, where a lot of examinations might just have like, wasting time or um, like not putting in enough attention to my vocation, something very vague or concern for my vocation, right? This is really flipping that script and making it a focus on your vocation, which I think is very appropriate because that's how we become saints. We become saints through our vocation, not despite it. Um, so uh, again, it was a kind of an odd little, little bee under my bonnet to give it a try, but it seems like it's been well received so far. I'm waiting to hear what censor says. Hopefully, we're hoping to get this for anyone who's just watching this. We're hoping to get this approved by the Archdiocese of St. Louis uh, for general distribution, so we can start sharing it in parishes. But it has to go through an approval process. So we're waiting to hear what uh, commentary we get from the theologians that review and censor it. And from
Following put
go ahead.
following putting this together, is there anything you and or Megan find yourself like, oh, maybe I should be more attentive? Like, has it either widened your consciousness or awareness, or made you more attentive to anything in particular that you
Mm,
feel comfortable discussing?
I think more just what I was saying about the importance of the vocation um, coming to the forefront. Um, because even when if something isn't explicitly a sin, our lives are filled with faults, right? And faults and venial sins, it's very hard to get through life without just them scattered here, there, and everywhere. A lack of charity towards one another, or a lack of attention, lack of prioritizing your spouse. But um, a renewed emphasis on um, the place of our vocation in our spiritual lives, I think, has been the fruit for me personally that's come from this. And I won't presume to speak for Megan how it's affected her, but
Hmm.
yeah, it
Yeah,
is
that's
fun. I will say, as a couple, like we've been doing this for coming up on 4 years now, and at first she would read almost everything I wrote, but now, I mean, I just wrote 35 articles, so she is not taking the time to read all those. She doesn't read quite everything that I write anymore, and but it is fun when I get done with a project that I'm like, hey, you want to go through this? So like a bit of a humorous example could be that I wrote the yes no maybe guide almost 2 years ago now, and we finally started working on it on a date night last week. Like,
hmm, wow.
just because we never have time to actually do our own our own projects. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, it's crazy. I mean, but yeah, it gets busy, but it is great that it is there to draw from.
Mhm.
You know, because it's crazy. We're here. We think about this a lot. My wife and I. We're here helping married couples, but at the same time, we have to keep track of our own marriages too.
Mhm.
You know, um, and that's not that'll be something too that even to consider. Like, man, at some point, we offer coaching, but wouldn't it be cool to even be able to coach the coaches and know that even the people who are out there who help can have advanced levels of help, or even people who just want to maintain,
Yep.
who want to make sure you see people. Well, I don't want to presume. I'm going to ask: is it fair to assume that at least most of the time when you're getting a couple, it's things have already gone bad, so let's get help, versus couples who actually we're doing pretty good, we just want to make sure it stays that way?
So the majority of couples are things have gone bad, right?
Right.
By the time
Yeah.
couples get to me, most of the time it's just they want to stop having bad sex. Um, Now, I do want to get them to the point where they recognize that that's not actually a goal; that's a negative goal. We don't do those. Um, we want to shoot for a positive of we want to have good sex, and actually, even that's not the actual goal, but we want to get to intimacy. Um, but I do have couples who are things are going well. And they just want to take it to the next level of intimacy, of connection. Um, Most of those cases have been couples, usually empty nesters or shortly to be empty nesters, kind of have having that opportunity to reflect on where their marriage is at, and maybe sex has just become sort of their routine. It's good, but common one we see there is like the wife isn't able to be satisfied by the act. So, and oftentimes at that stage, the women that have come to me where it's not in crisis like that, they're okay with that. They're kind of just offer that up, and they're not too worried about it. Um, but we do would end up addressing that issue because that is something that's worth giving attention to, that her needs be met. Um, but yeah, it does happen. It's not very often, but it does happen.
Is there anything you would offer? Let's maybe we have some couples who watch or are going to watch that things are generally pretty good. That you would offer them to still consider, like, hey, it could still be worth getting coaching, getting somebody as a couple to walk beside you to, you know, to keep you in that good place or take it, as you said, to the next level. Some people might think of, because see, some people might think of a good marriage as a luxury. But we know enough now to know that it's really a necessity, and to not have it has consequences, and that's obviously part of that. Maybe it's not obvious, but that's a big motivation for our work here, especially since we're a Catholic apostolate. Well, I don't know. Is there anything you'd offer couples to just be able to be like, well, hey, maybe things are pretty good, but here's something to consider?
So with that, already that mindset of things are pretty good. It's like, okay, what does that mean? You know, like y'all have sex once a month and check the box and it's okay. We're roommates, but we're amicable roommates. Um, what does okay mean? Um, and typically a couple that tells me things are good, things are okay. Once we start digging into it, it's they've just stopped addressing the issue. Right? Whatever the pain point was, they just try to ignore it. Because every couple, and I include myself in this, every couple has room for growth. Um, you know, and that goes for all spheres of intimacy. So I am not a saint, so I can already tell you that there's room in my marriage for growth and spiritual intimacy. Um, I do not always connect with my wife intellectually. She is a very smart, uh, very gifted woman, and I don't always click with her. Um, I have autism, so empathy is not my forte. Uh, and emotional connection is not very, like, it takes a little bit of effort. I have a very hard time reading people's emotions, which, as you can imagine, makes doing this a little bit complicated. Um, but it's like there's times where we have to be very deliberate about emotional intimacy, because if she doesn't tell me what her emotion is, I have absolutely no idea. And doesn't even occur to me to realize that there is something different, because it just doesn't get caught. Um, so there's plenty of room to work there. Physical intimacy, you know, I leave the house at 7:30 a.m. I get home at like 10:30 p.m.
Hmm.
So, physical presence is kind of a luxury for us. Plus, I'm still between writing and this and grad school, you know, um, half my weekends are filled here at the office, and then the others are at, on duty. So there's so much room to grow with, physical intimacy and just being present to each other, which is very difficult for us to squeeze in right now. Um, so my point with all that being that every couple does have somewhere to grow. So is where you have to grow somewhere that you can take care of on your own, that you're in a good enough spot to address that and continue growth? Or do you need someone to help you along? Maybe you've gotten so um, complacent that you're kind of stuck. Um, Sometimes that's when a third party would be like, hey, wake you up, kind of give you a poke and a prod, can be helpful. It's part of the difference between therapy and coaching. I don't really prod my therapy clients. Coaching clients, absolutely.
Hmm.
uh, all of my clients are very well aware that if you say something that I'm like, oh, I will call it out, and we'll chew on it a little bit. Um, because I feel that's part of the purpose here is to challenge. Sometimes it comes up in therapy too, but therapy is a different sort of mode in how we address change than coaching.
Yeah, this was not my only takeaway, but you just said something I didn't know that about you.
Hmm. Oh,
Did,
that I'm autistic?
I didn't.
Yeah, it's fun. I have autism and ADHD. Yeah.
How does how does that affect your coaching?
Um. So for one, it I fidget a lot. I have to be very intentional about um, what I do with my body
I
in
see.
coaching. Like I had a consult this afternoon. So Megan and I share an office space. She has her therapy practice here, and then I do this, and we each have an office. And she asked me to step over to her office for a consult with a client who might benefit from coaching. And so I went over there, and um, I didn't. They Megan and the client were like, "Oh, do you want to sit down? There's just a love seat, and then Megan's therapy chair." And I was like, "No, no, no, please sit down. I need to stand up.
Hmm.
I've been sitting for 4 hours, um, but I'm much more comfortable just standing up and kind of moving around." Um, so controlling my body is difficult. Controlling my facial expressions. As my dear wife points out, I have resting bitch face. I just have look angry all the time. Even though I'm not, I can be quite content and just you know, which works very well for the military. That is a preferred default facial expression.
I was wondering about that. Yeah.
And it also strikes some little bit of fear in all junior enlisted who see me walking by that I might, have them pushing the earth down,
Hmm.
which I do
Hmm.
on a regular basis anyways. So it just adds to the aurora. But yeah, being attentive to facial expressions um, and body language is something I've had to learn, um,
Hmm.
and sometimes can be a bit difficult. Um, yeah, it it's hard some maybe to say though, like how is it affecting me because it's the only way I've ever known.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
Like it's more like I know what the symptoms are and their reactions. Like this is something I'm familiar with clinically, and so I can say like, well, oh yes, these are when my symptoms are expressing, but it's also that
Mm-hmm.
like I wasn't diagnosed until adulthood, so like we were
Oh.
raised with the whole here's all your accommodations and this that and the other thing and you're medicated and all that. It was just figure it out, you know. So my skills, if you will, at adulting had learned without realizing I was trying to also compensate for um, this neurodivergence. But
Wow.
yeah,
That's huh.
yeah, I have an article um, on intimacy when ADHD is in your marriage coming out in a couple months. Um, it'll release on Patreon about a month earlier, so that's going to be available um, in the coming weeks. And then I also have one on this one's addressed to wives intimacy when your husband has autism spectrum disorder. It is more common in men than it is in women. There's probably partially because it's underdiagnosed in women, but even
Hmm.
so, it's just, the majority of cases that you're going to see presented, um, or it's going to be the husband who has it. I have had female clients with it. Makes it very difficult when the person who everyone expects to be empathetic in the relationship has zero emotion. Uh,
Yeah.
uh,
Wow.
yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
When
but
that's the case, I mean, that's not always the case for everybody who's on the spectrum. I mean,
no, it
it's a spectrum.
Right.
Is that still some of the phrases are always changing. Is on the spectrum still the way of speaking
Okay.
about?
I mean, it's
Okay.
still very much understood as a spectrum. ADHD is part of the spectrum. OCD is part of the spectrum. Um, you know, like Asperger's is part of the system, the spectrum, right? They're all overlap autism spectrum disorder in that sense. Now they are like OCD is a distinct diagnosis from odds, from ASD, but there still is a certain correlation and relationship between the two.
Sure.
That's why comorbidities are very common between diagnoses
Mm,
within the spectrum. They're clusters.
that makes so much sense. I didn't mean to make you go on
No,
about
that's
that, but
fine.
you mentioned thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Um, I thought there was a question I was going to ask, and then it escaped me. Um, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing about the examinations of conscience that kind of led us to this place. We've been really grateful to see, though, that people have been interested in them, because that was the big thing that got people to donate. Is we did an Easter campaign where if you donated in the first, t-
Hmm.
t- during Holy Week or Easter week, we would send that if $5 or more, we'd send that to you, and a lot of people were interested. If
Yeah.
anyone's watching and you're still interested, though, if you sign up and support us on Patreon.
Yep. You'll get access there and access to a bunch of new content that's coming out there.
We have a comment here by a Michael. I'm
Um,
sorry, friend. I don't know how to respond to your last name, but I appreciate this comment. Recently came across this apostolate. Was honestly relieved to see a Catholic source addressing specific questions about intimacy. Well, thank you, Michael. Really appreciate your comment. And if you have any specific questions, you're more than welcome to ask them here.
yeah, that's what we originally started this for, was for a Q&A. When we started this, the first one was just over a year ago, I want to say May of last
Do-
year.
Giving Tuesday.
No. Well, I mean, we restarted it Giving Tuesday, but remember
Oh,
our very first live Q&A was like,
yes. Yep.
yeah. Um, so and the hope is always, or the thought has always been, just to make it available for anyone to ask any questions they had or comments. We appreciate your comment, Michael. Try to be here for whoever has any questions, thoughts, concerns. Happy to address them.
Um, but we're glad that those examinations of conscience got a lot of traction, and that definitely inspires us too to want to create other resources alongside our articles. I mean, I'm glad we work in this particular area, not just because I'm passionate about it, as are you, obviously, but there's just so much you can do with marriage, family,
Mhm.
intimacy, conversations. Um,
Right.
Being a former seminarian, you might be able to appreciate this, but I find myself I get a one area of content that I can find myself consuming a lot of, really appreciating, but it's also kind of relevant, especially when you talk about married couples, is just like how to communicate.
Mm.
And lately, some of the sources I like on this, there's a lawyer named Jefferson Fisher, and there's another channel called How to Convince with Lawyer Vince. Shout out, guys. A lot of like, well, here's how to communicate in this situation. Um, I think when I was younger, I got made fun of a little bit, and I didn't really feel like I felt in. And there's sometimes there can be things we put our value in, right? So for me, two of those things were sports success. I
Mm.
played basketball, I played volleyball, wanted to be good, wanted to be one of the main people on the team. Grade school, I was. High school, not so much. But number two, this idea that I always have the right thing to say back to somebody, whether it's getting made fun of, or even, as I go into the seminary a little bit later, intellectual questions about faith and what have you.
Mm.
Um, you know, obviously communication is essential to marriage, but it's one of those things that if you can communicate well in marriage, you can probably communicate well in any particular relationship, other than the fact that the way you communicate with your spouse has to have a level, at least from time to time, of flirtatiousness. And the romance and the sexual attraction needs to be built in and underlying it. Otherwise, at least the principles of human respect, um, are respect, effectiveness,
Mhm.
what to say, how to say it, can more or less apply anywhere and in any particular relationship. So
Right.
even stuff like that can be, is relevant to what we're doing here too. But the reason I mentioned seminary though was one of the things I kind of wish I had a better grasp on at the time, or that I wish I would have absorbed better or learned.
Mhm.
Not saying they didn't teach it. I'm just saying maybe I didn't learn it or whatever. But I always had this like fear, like, oh, how am I supposed to deal with it if someone's standing in front of me yelling at me, which never happens in my marriage. And I mean that sincerely. But if you, even we're seminarians, right? Like you have a parishioner who's just so upset about the homily you just gave, or you
Mhm.
have whatever some conversation. How do we even handle that? I don't know. But I'm finding that whether you go on to get married or not, you should learn to communicate the way in such a way that you would be a good communicator with a spouse. um, Even sometimes you hear stories about uh, guys who get ordained to the priesthood, and then they have this relationship with the pastor that they're under as an associate, and you hear about instances of bad communication, and it's like, aren't you guys preparing couples to get married, but you're communicating with each other in a way that you would tell them never to communicate with each other? I don't know if you ever heard stories like this, but
Oh, far.
occasionally I have.
Plenty, plenty.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I was on assignment for like I was in parishes for 3 years. Out of my 10 years in seminary, I was in assigned on in parishes for three of those. Um, I mean, it comes down to the reality we're still human. As a here with coaching and therapy, like I've spent days and days and hours trying to learn to communicate effectively. Um, and I was just at a training in Texas a couple months ago, and throughout the weekend, just time and time again, I was realizing like how many little faults of what we call micro skills in therapy of like where they'd found their way in of um, asking closed-ended questions, or not summarizing or paraphrasing effectively, and just my communication was filled with faults, right? And while it can be frustrating, because I like to be really good at things, I like to be um, efficient, and it it's just another opportunity to grow. You're always going to have room for growth and learning to communicate better. Um, but I think that where a lot of people get um, uh, bogged down when it comes to marital communication is they think of communication as the transmitting, right? You are giving information, you're putting it out. And that's something I oftentimes point out is that's not quite accurate. That's broadcasting. You are just transmitting something out, and who cares who receives it? Hopefully, somebody. Um, but in communicating, properly speaking, like you are giving information, and the person receiving information receives the idea that you were trying to convey, right? Um, so there's both an active and a passive receptive element to good communication. Um, and most people have a certain affinity for the active part and are very, very poor at the receptive part. Um, so if a couple wants to grow in communication, the easiest thing of all. We don't need to talk about techniques for communication styles, and there are many good things out there, like the Gottmans like to encourage people to use I sentences, um, right, to
Yes.
soften conversations. But just being curious about your spouse and what do they have to say. Entering conversations with your spouse with a degree of curiosity um, can really change everything about your marriage. Like, when was the last time? I'm not asking you this directly, but like, you know, you went to your spouse and asked her how her day was, but not just like, okay, she's going to give me the information. Now it's my turn to say how my day was, but you just kept going, asking, like, what about this? What about that? What about that? Right? Not interrogating, but just being curious. Like, you're hungry to know everything about her day. Um, Very rarely, and I accuse myself of this as just as much. Very rarely do most people do that. But if you do, it's quite comical how quickly people are like, "You're such a good listener," you know, or you communicate so well. You might not have said anything except for asking questions the entire conversation, but people will feel heard and understood just by the fact you're asking questions. And it is quite important that your spouse feels seen and heard. So, yeah, curiosity
Yeah.
is a key.
Well, I mean, and if they don't feel seen or heard, that's gonna, I mean, how many of the issues then does the surface issues really come down to that? I don't feel seen, I don't feel heard, I don't feel loved, I don't feel connected.
Yeah, a lot of them.
I, intimacy involves a level of uh, kindness, but I do love that idea that intimacy it means to see into me, right?
Mhm.
But that means you're showing. And I know I just got blurry for a second there. That means, but you have to show that, right? It requires a vulnerability. One of the things that I was talking to a group of people about the other day is that a lot of times when things happen, we have a story about what those things mean, right? For example, our spouse leaves dishes in the sink. If that gets me upset, well, it isn't merely the fact that the dishes were in the sink that got me upset. It's I see the dishes in the sink, and that means something to me. I have a story about what that means. That's what gets me upset,
Right.
right? Because and so when that happens, you have to instead. It doesn't mean you suppress what you're feeling. Quite the opposite. It means you tell the actual story. Oh, when you did this, when you leave the dishes in the sink, I feel like you don't, or whatever. I feel undervalued. I feel taken for granted. I feel whatever it is you feel. Can we talk about it? And I'd like to think for most people that would, provide a much better way forward than, oh, you always leave dishes in the sink. You are a lazy slob.
Right.
But then, of course, and I did a video back when I was doing more videos for this where I kind of talked about that, right? Sometimes actually, it's Catholic teaching. Actually, it's in the Catechism from Saint Ignatius of Loyola that you're supposed to assign at least a positive or at least a benign interpretation to whatever other people do. So, how much more so your spouse? Now, maybe they leave the dishes in the sink again, or several times. Then maybe you ask, and I think it's even right there in the passage. Then you try to get a sense of what their motive was, and that's um, Jefferson Fisher has a good bit of like, oh, ask their intent. Like, did you mean to insult me? Did you mean for that to sound how it was? So then you can mean, did you mean to hurt me? Or did when you didn't pick up the dishes in the sink after we talked about it or whatever?
Yeah.
But it can be hard to deal with, when because a lot of times I think the stories we assign to things, it's we didn't consciously assign them. We kind of discover them.
Right.
We discover that, oh, this makes me feel, I feel a certain way when this happens. We don't we don't build we don't put in the we don't build in the trigger. We just discover that one is there. Now it's our responsibility, but it's not our fault. It's something we discover, right? But in that way, when these things happen, it can be quite healing for a family and even for an entire family tree, right? Because that becomes the process of yourself, and then you can, whatever more about yourself, you can not transmit to your kids, right? Because suffering not transmitted, or suffering not transformed, is transmitted. So
Hey, what you're describing is negative sentiment override. Um, the ideal is positive sentiment override, where if you observe something that is neutral, you're going to kind of assume it's a positive, and even negatives may be a bit more neutral than positive, obviously seeing them as positive. When a couple has gone into negative sentiment override, bad things are really bad, neutral things are bad, and positive things are lightly good or more neutral, right? And couples do not choose that. I've never known anyone who deliberately chose that. Um, it's just the how your brain figures out how to interpret things when things have not been going well for a while. Um, and it's incredibly common. Um, I'd say the majority of couples that come to me are in some form, some degree of negative sentiment override, right? Um, because even if they think the whole issue in their marriage is about sex, um, usually it's not just that. There's a lot of elements at play here, and sex in those cases is just the barometer of the relationship. Um, so the negative sentiments around sex, actually, there's negative sentiments kind of across the relationship. So yeah, that's what you were describing. Um, yeah, that work from the Gottman Institute.
yeah. No, that's awesome. I think when it comes to the stories and meanings that we assign to things, then that can certainly happen in the bedroom. I mean, if you have a man who has erectile dysfunction, right? I'm sure he discovers or creates a whole lot of stories around that, about what it means about him, and
Mhm.
likewise the wife about what it might mean about her.
Yep.
Is this something? Do you have to help these couples to assign different meanings to these things when they happen while they're in the process of working through
Mhm.
these kinds of issues?
So assigning meaning is one way of doing it. It's not. Um,
Or detaching meaning, like, or refusing
right.
to assign meaning, maybe.
So what you're describing, like assigning meaning, is a therapeutic or coaching intervention that is done in some models. Um, we I want to say it's most like the preeminent one is motion focused therapy. Um, I could be mixing that up, but it feels like that's EFT. But my coaching and therapy are uh, built in the solution focused brief therapy tradition. So um, I'm going to spend a lot less time focused on the meaning of it and more focused on how do we deal with it, right?
Mm,
Um, and part of that is, yes, can be stripping away the meaning, but we're not going to address it as such.
got
We're
it.
going to focus on, okay, what's causing this? Okay, this is something outside of your control. We're going to acknowledge what is the barrier, and then how do we overcome that barrier? And oftentimes it is a mindset thing. I've had many cases of ED where the husband was on Viagra or another medication. Some were also using penis pumps, which is basically a vacuum tube to try to pull blood into the penis so they can get erect or stay erect. Um, a variety of different interventions, and still struggle with ED. And it's about this perception, right? That they have failed their wife, or they aren't doing a good enough job, and they actually will cause their own ED by their performance anxiety. So, in the sense of meaning, we have to strip the ED of meaning. We have to, and part of that process is stripping sex of being a performance, which that's a difficult thing to do. It's very hard to say, okay, where our goal is to get you to having great sex, and like the wife to reach orgasm, which oftentimes is not happening either in those cases. But here's our goal, and by the way, we don't have any goals. So sometimes there's interventions that I have to do where I tell them where we're trying to get to, but then I say, well, your goal is to not have any goals, let go of goals, let go of performance, and let me hold on to the goals, and just trust where we're going, which some couples have an easier time with than others. But yeah, did that answer the question?
No, I mean, yeah, definitely. But I mean, sometimes these things are going to be a process sometimes, though, right? Whether the guy, just in the case to carry on the ED example for a second, whether he's, whatever it is, if it's psychological causes, whatever it is so deeply ingrained. Sometimes it's not psychological, right? Sometimes it's physiological, and those issues take time to resolve too. So, in the meantime, you can't be without intimacy. I mean, obviously we have all these fourfold forms of it, right? But in the meantime, intimacy in some form is still something that has to be engaged in to have, your good married lives and your relationships. So, so how do you still do that while you're working toward how you want it to look, right?
So we typically what we're going to do is just change their physical intimacy during the initial phases of the program. So um, for ED, typically the way I'm going to have a program specifically for that. Um, and typically we're going to meet every other week to give them time to be intimate in between sessions, but they uh, are typically, depends on the couple and where they're at mentally with everything. Um, but if a couple has very deeply ingrained anxiety around sex, then we'll actually have them cut sex entirely out until they get through to stage 5 of sensate focus. Um, and so that the only times that they really have physical contact um, in a sensual way is through the sensate focus exercises, which help to strip away the performance, the anxiety, and just help a couple to become more grounded, and actually can, if done can have the effect of actually making your spouse's body something that grounds you. Almost like, people will have like a fidget or something that helps them to come back into the present moment. Um, that can be one of the effects of sensei focus, is your spouse's body actually being able to do that for you.
Hmm.
Um, and by being able to stay in the present moment, then you performance anxiety is about something future, right? You're going to mess up. If you can stay in the present moment, it doesn't really leave much space for anxiety. So by pulling them in the moment, we're able to avoid a lot of that. And usually when they do restart having sex, which is part of the 5th stage, um, and even how, so in stage 5, even how we have them have sex for the first time in that stage is probably something that I'm going to say different in a different way they ever have before. The act is still completed, like it is still a complete marital act, but the everything around how you go into that is going to be different than most couples will have ever done. Again, stripping away a lot of the show and spectacle of things. So yeah, it depends on where a couple's at, how deeply ingrained the stressors are, what track how we're going to address that. But yeah, there's plenty of things we can do, fortunately.
And you have a blog, you have an article on Sensate Focus on the blog, don't you?
Yep.
So
I touched
maybe
on it
something.
briefly there. I've written on it before in other blogs, not on Catholic intimacy. And I have like handouts and stuff that I give my clients. But it's one of the oldest, still currently used sex therapy interventions. It's been around since at least the 60s, which in the world of clinical sexology is ancient. Um, as a field, it only goes back to about the 1920s. Um, so, yeah, it can be very effective for a lot of different disorders.
I'll place that in the that article in the chat here if people want to, read it a little bit later. Um, cool. So one of the reasons I'm big on this theme right now of the meaning we assign to things, actually, I don't know if I've told this story. I'll probably write an article about it myself, but so I'm applying this to marriage, but I think I'll given the passing of my two sons. That's one of the I think a lot about the Garden of Eden, and I think about what it meant for us to eat the fruit of the tree, and what it meant for us to obtain knowledge of good and evil. They already knew what was good and what not to do, therefore what was evil. So it wasn't merely an intellectual knowledge, but by consuming the fruit, they had an experiential knowledge. But I also think it gave them, and therefore all of us, this ability or this false sense that we know what's best. And I was recently, convicted of the fact that God wants us to rely on Him and trust Him so much that we let go of our own judgments about what we think is best, not our moral judging of good and evil, but our other sense of what we think is best, because He's the one who determines what's best. When my voice was hoarse in the last few live streams and what have you, I found myself having this kind of back and forth with God, especially because I was leading up to a big project for my full time job at Covenant Eyes that involved my voice. And actually, it was delayed for a little bit on account of my voice. The the first for the when it was initially scheduled, and at the same time as this, I'm realizing that following the death of my sons, one of the spiritual effects, it didn't affect my faith or even my sense of trust, but it did affect my ability to be able to just pray to God, petitionary prayers, ask Him for stuff. Well, He already knows what's going to happen anyways. Oh, you want me to pray for your grandma or whatever? Like, okay, like in my mind, like, yeah, okay, whatever's going to happen is already going to happen. Why should I ask Him? We prayed day and night for my son to get better, and he didn't. So why should I even bother asking? Well, the crazy thing is, so I had intellectually come to the realization that, well, God wants us to be in a relationship with Him, and therefore we should ask Him what we want and then trust Him. So I intellectually was able to grasp that, but at some point after I lost my voice, it wasn't a total loss. I could still talk, but after it went hoarse, I was having another conversation with a friend, with an acquaintance, and and he was talking about something that came up in his own prayer, and I was like, oh, it's kind of interesting. He talks back, whatever, and we're talking back and forth. But then he said to me, he goes, like your mind gets it, but your heart hasn't bought in yet. And I'm like that just hit me, man. That just hit me. And I that's what I realized. That was something that I realized. And I realized that God in some ways needed me to come to that realization that there was still this disconnect between my head and my heart. And so leading up to this project that involved my voice, I'm driving to where it is and I'm just going back and forth like, man, my voice still isn't where I want it to be. And so I'm asking you, God, I'm going to humble myself and actually ask you for something. But I'm also thinking the whole time like, man, He's not going to do it. I'm going to get in front of that camera. I'm going to croak. It's going to be bad, and it ended up okay, actually. But in this going back and forth, I just realized like, man, I got to let go of my sense of what's better. or worse? What's good or bad?
Yeah.
If I'm going to get in front of that camera and croak, and if he's going to let me do it, it must be good for me somehow, spiritually.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm just convicted that like I gotta trust him,
Mhm.
for what's better, for worse. And ultimately, if something comes up, even if it be actual evil that he's permitted, it's somehow spiritually good for me, and not just for me. There's a lot of other people that God consider, literally the whole world, that have to be considered when what he allows and permits and doesn't allow goes on. I mean, that's what he told Job basically, right? Like,
Mhm.
consider all these other parts of my creation. You didn't
Mhm.
make them, I did. You're not the center of the world, buddy. So I find myself now applying all this, and it's true in marriage too, right? What meaning do we assign to the way things should be?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you can get to the bottom of that, then you'll have good communication with your spouse. If you can let go of that in general, then you can trust God to really be the one who knows what's not just good and evil, but better and worse for you and everybody else in the world.
Mhm.
Anyways, I know it's long,
Something.
but there's
No, thank you
spiritual
for
experience
sharing.
for you.
Thank you for sharing about that. Um, that what you're saying about, one being convicted of it, but two, um, just that reiteration of the importance of trust in the relationship, right? And our relationship with God is so essential. Um, when couples are struggling with communication, with trust, I totally lost where I was going with that.
um,
I have no idea. Yeah, I had thought I had a beautiful nugget to like tie into that, and then carried on, and yep, I lost it. Yeah. Oh well. Must not have been that important.
if you think of it, by all means, interrupt and
Yeah.
share it. Um,
Yeah.
so hard, but that I can see where that's a real purification process, because expectations, hopes, my perception of the way things should be,
Mm.
man, that's really where we experience the most pain in our lives, at least emotionally, or at least even the most suffering, right? This should be like this. This shouldn't
Mhm.
have been this way.
Yeah.
Um, I should have performed better.
Yeah. So I remembered what I was going to say. You know, Part of why it's so important to express our needs in prayer and our desires in prayer is just the fact of like expressing them helps our psychology, right? It's good for us to say our needs. Um, and we see this in marriage, right? Where um, I regularly see cases where spouse will come to me and the wife's like, my needs aren't really met, but like, whatever. Um, and when we start talking about what are their goals, she doesn't want to say, she's like, well, if that happens, that's great, but we don't really need to worry about it. And I'm like, no, to we need to address your needs and pursue them. And I end up showing them frequently that while she thinks that not getting her needs met only affects her, it actually affects the relationship in a much larger way than she realizes. And so it's for the good of her spouse to meet her needs, but also that she needs to communicate. She needs to say what it is. Now, can he always fix it? No. Is it always going to turn out that way? No. But she needs to communicate what are her needs, what are her desires, right? Because that's how we have a conversation, right? And that's how we communicate by sharing and by receiving. So, a common example of this is in the yes, no, maybe guide, right? Without fail, every couple I've ever done this with, we'll get into it. And at some point, usually the husband will say, well, I want to say yes to this, but I'm pretty sure she's going to be a no. And I'm like, she has her own column. She can answer yes or no. Why are you trying to adjust your thought to what she needs? It's like, well, I don't want to say yes, and then she says no. I was like, it's amazing. You can want something and her be a no, and y'all not do it. Because if either spouse is a no on something, then we just don't do it. It's off the table for the time being. You know, you don't have to try to guess what she is and negate and reject your own needs and desires to meet her needs. You can say, yes, I'd be interested in doing that, and her say no and just not do it. But you need to express it. You need to be vulnerable enough to allow her the opportunity to say yes or no. And so, in asking God for what we specifically need and want, we give him the opportunity to respond, versus just him doing whatever he's going to do. We don't know how much of a role our prayers have in the divine plan, right? Prayers do have an effect. We don't know. I mean, it might be like a tiny thimble worth of, effect versus God's ocean of mercy, right? But in his great calculation, he calculated for the amount of, grace to supply for this issue, that thimble was counted in that amount, right? So our communication with him, our participation with him has an effect. We don't know how much, but it is there. And same thing in marriage. When we express our needs, we express our desires, we give the opportunity for communication, the opportunity for connection, even if sometimes it's a no. But if we never open the door, then we may have a bunch of no's, but we also can't have yeses. So that vulnerability, and this goes back to the very definition of intimacy. Intimacy is secure vulnerability, an interpersonal state of secure vulnerability. Therefore, to be intimate, you must be woundable. You must be vulnerable. And for that other person to have built the expectation that you will be safe, that you will be secure. Both in our marriages and in our relationship with God, we have to be woundable. To be intimate with God, we have to be one. Well, I mean, he's kind of all powerful and we're kind of not. So it's like, in a sense, we are always woundable, yes. But are we making ourselves woundable? When we ask for something and invite his direct response, because we say, oh, whatever you want, then, well, we didn't really have an opinion in the matter. He just chose whatever. But when we ask for something specific, we are now making ourselves woundable because we have taken a side. And now if he says yes, cool, it was in our favor. If he says no, now it's opposed to our will. Right? But in that effort, we are making ourselves woundable, we're making ourselves more accessible to grace and to that interaction. And even if we don't actually have a strong will for it, but we are being open, and that's the key. So, anyways, that was a little bit of a diatribe.
Wow. Well, and that just shows me that my hesitation to really, pray prayers of petition and become invested in certain outcomes was a form of self-protection.
Exactly. I mean, I can tell you I do the same thing. My wife and I have been trying to get pregnant for almost 5 years. We've done all the medications, we've tried to get surgery, we've gone through TRICARE rejecting it, we've tried through self-pay, we've tried this, that, and the other thing, we've tried to adopt, we've tried to foster. Anytime we tell somebody, we're trying to get pregnant or we can't get pregnant, then they immediately have the like, hey, well, have you tried this? Like, oh, please shut up. Like, yes, we have. Name it, we have. Like, been there, done that. It didn't work. And for, many reasons. And again, all of it's in providence. And it's very hard now to hope to get pregnant. It's very hard to hope and say that in prayer, both of us. Megan even more so than me.
Mm-hmm.
But it is Like there's times when, and I will say these days I don't pray for that every day like I used to, because even just the ask is painful. But it is still something we desire. Um, and it probably would be a greater act of virtue to pray for it every day, but I'm not there yet. Um, yeah, it,
Yeah, so you get it.
yeah, that is the catch-22. If you want to be intimate, you have to be woundable, and you will be wounded, even
I
in the
guess that's
most
why.
perfect way.
Well, but the other thing too is, he made himself woundable,
Exactly.
and not just woundable, but wounded. That's why I thought it was beneficial to share that. In for Holy Week in our Byzantine church, we call it the week of the bridegroom.
Right.
And that is partly due to the parable of the 10 virgins, where they say, oh, the bridegroom is coming. So it orients our goal, our focus toward the end times, but also because this is what he went through to be the, to make himself the bridegroom of the church.
Right. Something I'd like to think about when I'm thinking about the woundability when it comes to intimacy, right? Because God, how does God hurt us, right? Because like I said, if you are woundable, like if it is in philosophy, like if it is capable of that thing, it will be that thing at some point, right? And kind of St. Thomas talks about this in the ways of knowing the existence of God, right? Of what is possible. At some point, it will be. Okay. So if you are woundable, at some point you will be wounded. Okay. Otherwise, it would not be woundable. Um, and so we look at the saints. It's like, well, all of the saints were wounded by divine love. And to me, one of the most beautiful, we have several absolutely gorgeous examples. St. Philip Neri, with his heart expanding with love so much that he actually broke his ribs. Um, and then, but an even more um, touching one for what we deal with here at the apostolate is actually um, the divine marriage of Teresa of Avila. And the reason I bring that up is, have you ever seen the sculpture by Bernini of the divine marriage, the ecstasy of Saint Therese?
No.
So it's, can't remember
Where
which
is
church.
it?
It's in Rome. I can't remember what church now, but
I haven't been to Rome yet, fortunately.
um, let's. Can you maybe pull it up? Um, but it's
Sure.
Bernini's Saint Teresa, and when he created this piece, it actually almost was rejected from being able to be used in a church. Um, the Holy Office had to go and basically plead his case to the Holy Office for them to sign off and allow it to be kept in this church, because um, according to the theologians who were um, reviewing the piece, um, they thought her facial expression and the way her body was that it expressed orgasm. And actually, if you look at,
Are
uh,
we?
let's see, I can't see it yet, but maybe it'll take. Yes. So,
Is this it?
mhm. So the thought was that if you look at her face looks like that of a woman in orgasm, and so it was um, too carnal or sort of debasing the beauty of this mystical marriage. Um,
Mm.
and however, it ended up being permitted because of the argument that, one, orgasm is the closest physical um, thing we have to ecstasy, right? It's the closest purely natural thing to that thing. So portraying it that way is not entirely wrong. But it's also interesting that this is the moment of her mystical marriage, And there's the arrow piercing her heart. And again, the face of someone in orgasm, but also someone in pain. That, and she describes it as painful, and yet out of body and pleasurable, and all of these sorts of emotions and sensations all bound up. And interestingly, okay, I realize I'm kind of going all over the place, but I hadn't exactly prepared this. But in the Middle Ages, the common sort of colloquial term for an orgasm was the little death.
Mm.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think this is a one. I love Bernini. He's my favorite of the Baroque artist. I've spent many a happy hour contemplating God through his works. Um, but yeah, it's interesting that this one was almost rejected because of how carnal it was thought to be. And it was actually in saying, yes, it is carnal, but this is as close as we can express. Um, to come even slightly close to expressing how she felt in that moment. Being very woundable. So, yeah.
I think what you said. First of all, I've never seen that sculpture before, so thank you for that. The little death, that's interesting too, because I someone brought that to my attention somewhat recently, and there's some science behind it. But I mean, yeah, spouses, when they experience climax in their intimacy, they kind of die into each other.
Yeah. It's also when you're very woundable. Like,
Yeah,
even on a physiologically, you are more woundable during orgasm. Like,
yeah, yeah. No, exactly. Is there any you know, reflecting on the little death, or is it, what is that called, petite morte? I mean, is there any theology either that's there or that we could take from it?
not that I know of. Yeah, I mean, it's the la petite mort, uh, le petit mort. My French is getting old. Um, you know, I'm familiar with the term from the Middle Ages. I don't know how much was developed into that. There's not a lot of writings at that time period on um, orgasm, especially woman's orgasm. Um, I've heard so much, and I need to actually sit down and read it, but that Saint Hildegard of Bingen talks about a woman's orgasm. Um, the ways that it has been quoted or used, her supposed writings on this, I'm like, I don't think a saint said that, but I haven't.
Wait, Saint
Hildegard,
Hildegard.
Hildegard of Bingen, the newest of the female doctors.
Oh,
Supposedly she talks about it again. I've heard about it, but the context that somebody was referring to her was borderline heresy. So I don't think that she was saying that. Um, at least that was being misquoted, but I have not actually gotten into her works to see what she did say on the matter. Um, yeah, there is very little on the subject because again, um, in the Middle Ages, it was the height of the scholastic period, right? And the scholastics were concerned with developing dogmatics and morals and canon law. That following the scholastic method is very good at getting very precise um, conclusions,
hmm.
right? And two theological questions, and the theological questions of the day are what makes it valid, right? What makes it legitimate, right? Well, when we're talking about validity and laicity with regard to the marital act, right? Um, as the act proper to marriage, we only need the husband's ejaculation. Technically, we don't even need his orgasm. It's very rare to have a man ejaculate without orgasm, but it is possible. And technically, you have completed the act. It is a licit act if you done properly. So, in a lot of older texts, if orgasm is acknowledged, it's more of like, yeah, this is like a happy bonus, like it's kind of extra. Um, in some texts, now you get into the moralist, like Saint Alphonsus Liguori. I don't think uh, some of the authors he quotes, even older text. Um, of course, the manualists all talk about this. Um, there you're going to see it referred to in how, but in terms of how can you licitly get there. So
Right.
what acts are permissible to do to get the wife there? And some are pretty blunt about it. They straight up say that the woman is colder blooded,
Right.
um, and will need some help. They don't particularly talk about the reasons, like the advantages of it. Um, they simply acknowledge that you can do it X, Y, or Z way. Um, and that's part of the reason why I've written so many things about the importance of a woman's orgasm, because there's not much out there about why this is important and why couples should be concerned about it, aside from the pleasure aspect, but for the overall good of the marriage. I actually written a couple papers, which have rather irritated my professors, about the importance of orgasms for marital satisfaction. Uh, I proposed that as a research study, and my professor promptly shot it down. Uh,
Mm.
but I think there is still much to be said and written on that topic of
Oh
the
yeah.
importance.
I
Um,
am. I am grateful for the. I mean, the manualists. I mean, it's a welcome development. First of all, that they permit it. Second of all, that they talk about it. I mean,
well, the thing
uh,
to note too is it's not that they're even permitting it, because we Americans, we tend to be a bit more Germanic in our moral theology, and basically in the idea that um, everything that is not forbidden is permitted, right? Like we have to, like, the default is that everything's forbidden, but so if we're like, well, did they say you can do that? I've had so many people. Well, does it matter? Like, where does it say you can't?
right. No,
Right
I agree. I agree.
now, fortunately, as the development of doctrine and extension of works, Liguori on and even before, there are theologians that say yes, you can, but again, that the very fact that you're asking, well, can you, and you need someone to say you can, already shows a certain degree of Jansenism. That's a bit of a harsh term, perhaps, but in how we think about sex. And I think that's
Yep.
because, especially with Americans, much of our culture around sex is actually from the Puritans.
Right.
And we don't realize how strongly influenced our concept of the human body, of the human person, and of sex has been influenced by Protestant sources, um, which are strongly influenced by the Manichaeans, by the Jansenists, etc., um, in sort of their disdain for the body. Because again, the freedom that, again, I don't know, that's a whole tirade I could go down.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And a lot of our apostolate work is, dedicated to that. And I mean, but again, we could list, not that it needed to be permitted, but just, I am grateful that, Bishop Kenrick and, fathers, Ford and Kelly and Prumer and, well, they address these questions
mhm,
and
about it, yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, we could go down the list. And these guys are heavy hitters, but they are definitely, some of them would certainly be, and that's part of our whole compendium, right? But they
Mhm.
are, um, some of them can even get offensive to some Puritan or Jansenist sensibilities. but thankfully we're
Very
Catholic.
much so.
What's that?
I said very much so. And it's almost
Yeah.
comical. And people realize, like, oh no, yes, theologians well before Vatican II taught these things in
Yeah.
Latin.
Yes. Yes. Well, and these were clerics.
And they were writing for that's the other thing that people don't realize, like the manualist and most of these texts of moral theology, well, all of the old texts of moral theology were not written for the faithful. The theology
They're
for the
written.
faithful was catechetics. That's what you taught the faithful was catechetics. Like, here's what to do to get to heaven, right? That's it. The science of theology, not that it was being held back from them, just that it was like no more than you're going to historically teach everyone about how to, practice medicine, or the science of music, right? Everyone can appreciate it and benefit from these things, but not everyone needs to do it. Now in the modern society, we have access to loads of information. We think we're even more educated, but in those times, like all of these texts were written for theologians. They were written for confessors and for use in preparing themselves to hear confessions, not for your average parishioner to pick up and figure out what they're allowed to do in the bedroom.
Now that hits on another point also. Like most of these things are probably aren't getting talked about in homilies at this time. So, were people just basically, given the main principles, left to figure out the rest, and then, oh well, if they seem troubled about this and it comes up in the confessional, like, oh, here's what you say back or whatever. Is
I
that
mean,
more or less how it was?
I suspect that what was happening back then more often than perhaps now was oral tradition, right? That familial formation of being taught, here's what to expect, here's what to prepare for, right? Your sex ed came from your parents,
Hmm.
more than from any other sources, right? You didn't have, the parochial, NFP class, right, for marriage prep. You learned from your parents. And then if you had something that offended your conscience you weren't sure about, then you ask in confession, you know. And that's why some of the texts, like so we had a comment recently, somebody asked, why does St. Alphonsus say it does not exceed venial sin? Right. Well, it's because the text in question was written for confessors to help them figure out when somebody's confessing this, is it actually a sin? And if so, how severe of a sin is it? Right? Because that's what the confessor needs to know. And so if he's saying it does not exceed venial, it's to let that confessor, hey, this person thinks it's a mortal sin, they're being scrupulous. We need to educate them on what the actual severity of the sin is. And that's why more often than not, you're not going to see where these theologians are talking about what is permitted. They're going to be talking about if something is sinful and how sinful, because their focus was on addressing things that would be brought up in the confessional.
I mean, and let's just consider also like your parochial NFP class. Like that's one thing now. I mean, we realize the irony of the fact that we're on the internet, but how many people are getting on the internet? And obviously, that's a great way to learn things. But you
Right.
get,
I was
but
it
then
was
you
really
get
funny when we first started this back in 2022. Um, we had somebody who I can't remember if they commented on the site or they emailed us, and they said, "Well, what you're saying is excellent, but really this needs to be said by a priest or a deacon to a couple as they're preparing for marriage." And I was like, "Well, that's great. We wouldn't do this if priests and deacons were doing that, because they're not. Most of them don't have this formation." And I've had Catholic clergy as clients where I had to teach them what the church taught on some of these matters. And yes, they were married Catholic clergy who were asking me. It's like, this person is ordained and preaches, teaches on moral theology, teaches on moral matters, advises souls, and they're having to ask me about the nuances of sexual ethics, right? And I don't accuse them for not knowing what they don't know, right? Now that they do know, hopefully they'll correct and maybe read more, but there's very few resources out there. Like the only reason that Alexander and I have access to so many of the texts that we do is because we both read French and Latin. And I think he also reads Italian too. Like if it wasn't
interesting.
for Huh?
Impressive.
I mean, well, he's studied for, I have no idea, probably since he was about 2 years old. He has a walking encyclopedia.
Yeah,
He's more
right.
artistic than I am some days. But, being in seminary for 10 years, kind of, you can pick up a few things.
But some things, there are some of the conclusions that we have to rebut.
Mhm.
God didn't, Jesus Christ, when he established the church, there wasn't a presumption that people would be chronically online. But now you get people who, you have the Summa posted online, which is great, but
Yeah.
like, oh, well, what happened? We didn't hold to every single conclusion in here.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, yeah, we developed on what we thought needed developing or whatever, but now you just get whoever who can go online
Right.
and be like, oh, well, what about this thing that was written a long time ago by this when these things were being written for clergy to determine what to pass on, to determine how to address when this comes up in the confessional, and now all of a sudden it's on here, and we just, and now it's a fight of like, oh, well, how do we interpret this, and and
Yeah.
this saying too, and it's like, oh man,
I,
oh, the church never told us about this thing that it said, 500 years ago. Well, I
yeah.
mean,
I think everyone in whatever profession somebody might be, they can acknowledge like there are things on the internet that are going to be wrong with regard to their profession, right? You know, like, if you talk to a medical doctor, they're going to be ever so frustrated when they have, uh, patients coming in with, their degree from in medicine from ChatGPT, right? Because as a professional, right? Yeah, sure, this is a computer and has access to all this knowledge, but as someone who practices, there's a certain degree of art and science to it,
mhm,
and to nuance and be able to see things that maybe you plugged in all your symptoms into ChatGPT, but you didn't know something else was a symptom. You didn't know something else was should even be considered, right?
right.
And that's where a lot of people, what they look, the the answer very often is correct based on what they said, but they don't know what they don't know to ask, to bring up, to check. That's why they actually do have like diagnostic tools using AI in hospitals, because it was built by
Sure.
physicians who know the things to put into that. Like even me for therapy and coaching clients, right? I have an app that like transcribes the session. It's all HIPAA certified and everything, but it transposes all of that into a clinical note at the end of the session, right? And uses the proper vocabulary and everything else because it was built for this purpose, right? It's very good. So the point of that being that sure you can get good stuff off the internet, but like a physician going, sure, but you're not asking the right questions. Somebody like, well, this thing should work X, Y, or Z, an electrical, and an electrician going, yeah, but you're not taking into account this, right? Every profession, everybody probably has something that they can say, it's not quite right on, your armchair mechanic or your YouTube mechanic, whatever, or, your YouTube doctor, or as the case may be. But in that same thread, your armchair theologian may be missing things and not know what they don't know, right?
Mhm,
Um, you know, Traditionally in theology, you start with philosophy,
right.
and you have a whole formation in philosophy before you begin theology, because there's a progressus. You need to go through these things in order, right? Like the Summa, every article builds on the preceding ones. And very often, St.
Mhm,
Thomas does not repeat himself. He just kind of assumes you remember, hey, 3 books before, we came to this conclusion in this point, which now we can assume or use for an evidence in a later conversation where we're not trying to prove that thing we already did. So we're just going to slap it in here and come up with our argument. All right. Well, if you haven't learned the progression, you haven't learned this kind of with him, you're going to be missing pieces, you know? And especially if you come at it with no philosophical formation, right? You're not going to understand how is he reasoning. If you're like, oh, well, I learned logic at, in college. Well, everybody has to take logic. Cool. What type of logic? Because if you took, modern symbolic logic, good luck. Aquinas is not going to work for you,
Right.
you know. Or let's say you did learn some basics of like logic, and so you could reason, but what was your philosophical principle? If you're trying to read Aquinas with a Hegelian mindset, again, you're going to be lost as last year's Easter egg because it simply does not fit your philosophical paradigm. And even within the Catholic sphere, like right now we have the personalism is very popular, right? Um, Ever since the um, oh, what's that couple's name? They were Germans, um, von Hildebrand,
Oh yeah.
right? So the von Hildebrands were personalist, okay, and John Paul II was a personalist. Um, and it was a very popular philosophical understanding, which is fine. I mean, it's one way to look at the human person, but there's one thing. It's one thing to contemplate the human person. It's another thing to take that philosophy and try to go to the full extent, right? And once you start getting into theology, that's when you see personalism start to fall to pieces because the conclusions start veering off because the structure you're trying to apply these theological reasonings to doesn't hold up when you come down to the reality, the objective reality of the human person. And that's where the Thomistic line is going to hold up because the whole system was built on that same logic, So it's going to make sense if you understood how Aquinas reasons to then read his text and to understand when his logic still holds, but maybe one of these pieces of data that he had stuck in doesn't apply. And there's actually new data we have to consider or something else we need to bring into play. You know, that's where a lot of these armchair theologians, get stuck in as they read the text. And one, maybe they understood it. Maybe Aquinas is difficult to read. I mean, even if you're reading in a native language, like it's not an easy read. I mean, that's why the manualist became a thing because even seminarians and theologians having to teach seminarians were struggling because it's very difficult to grasp. We don't write in that style. He wrote in a style that was very common academically for his style. Does not. It's not the only summa. There's many, many summas that were written, right? But people were accustomed to reading that, and so they were predisposed to understand his arguments and how he is reasoning. Already in our modern day, we are not predisposed that way. We don't use logic and language the same way. So you have all those things, and then those philosophical elements. I hopefully you understood what he said, but very often they get a piece of it and they miss others. And it's in those nuances, those pieces, where a lot of these big debates end up online, and for really no good. I mean, these are things that if a lot of these people just would sit down with the theologian for 10 minutes and listen reasonably, and versus just needing to proclaim their opinion online, they pretty quickly realize like, no, that doesn't hold up. Um, yeah.
Absolutely. No, very, very good. So, yeah, well, we're probably wrapping up on
Yep.
time here. But I mean, I think we had a very good discussion. We're very happy with the way things are headed. We're very grateful for everyone who's been supportive this month. We hope to see that continue, and we'll certainly do our part to make it worth your while. And as we continue to, write new articles and develop new resources and new incentives and all of that. I just have to ask real quick. I see in your background is that a pillow from the apostolate branding on there?
Oh, yeah, except for it doesn't have the cross. This was one of the early. attempts at the logo. Um,
I see.
and I thought it'd be fun to try to make it did not work. The backside is like all the image is messed up, but yeah, I didn't really have another place to put it, so I just stuck it there, and
Well,
it's
I only asked that because that wouldn't be a bad one to get if we could get it with the new logo on there. That wouldn't be a bad one to try and get in our store.
yeah, you can get it there print on demand, but it's there never was much interest in them. I think that pillow was the only one I ever actually made. Um,
At least not yet.
yeah, I mean, we might get to it eventually. That's what we need a graphic designer for, which is why we need people to donate so we can afford a graphic designer to actually make stuff that people actually would want.
Sure, sure. Um, well, cool. Very good. Any closing thoughts for this month?
Yep. Thank you for hosting this as usual.
Of course. Well, stay tuned, everybody, for more stuff. I know once my voice kind of went, things kind of slowed down on YouTube. It's back. So, there is some things we're looking at to try and, get more active again. But in the meantime, thanks everyone for continuing to support us. So please, if you haven't yet, please donate. Please, sign up on Patreon and yeah, and thanks for being part of our mission and sticking with us. All right, well, so thanks for another good conversation, James. So we will call it for tonight, and um, yeah, we'll look forward to the next time you see us.
Awesome. Well,
All right, well, so for all of us at AMI, God bless. Have a great rest of your night.
bye.